much for introducing us. Thank you for having us, Alice and Audrey. And Amanda, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss your book, your fantastic book, with you tonight. Congratulations. I truly, truly enjoyed reading it and have so much to ask you. And thank all of you for being here with us tonight. So Amanda's book is both a survey and an argument. And I want to let her tell you a little bit about sort of the span of history that it covers, and then maybe we'll get to the argument part. Amanda writes, this book is the story of how a nation attempted to unmake itself by stripping undesirable groups and individuals of their citizenship over the course of 2 centuries. People are supposed to choose the government, you write, but you're interested in instances in which the government attempts to choose the people. These groups and individuals we learn over the course of the book include formerly enslaved people, such as Dred and Harriet Scott, Americans of Chinese descent, Japanese Americans, soldiers who fought for foreign armies or defected or seceded as well, hundreds of Mexican Americans during the mass repatriations of the mid-20th century, and thousands of naturalized citizens whose actions suggested to the government that they lacked requisite attachment to the US. Can you tell us, just to orient ourselves, Amanda, tell us about the significance of American citizenship legally and otherwise?
Yes, so first I want to say a big thank you in our work and our interests. And thanks to the audience for taking the evening with us. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. So your question about the significance of citizenship. So legally, and of course I'm a law professor, so legally citizenship is about access to the full rights of membership in a society. And in the United States, if you're a citizen, you first and most importantly have the right to enter and remain in the United States, which is so important today with COVID, we've seen, right? And then the right to vote, of course, comes with citizenship today, and the right to serve in government. So those are the essential rights of participation that come with citizenship. And of course, non-citizens are excluded from those rights. So that's the legal significance. But the book is about more than just that legal significance. It's also, as you know, about the sense of identity and belonging that come with being a citizen, and the efforts of the US government to remake the definition of American by excluding and stripping citizenship from certain groups.
Okay, so what is so great about the book is not only does it give us a theoretical and legal overview of citizenship, but you've elected to use case studies of particular people whose citizenship has been stripped. And as a reader, it was, just a really, these studies are really detailed, and the story of each person gives you a different angle on citizenship. I wanted to just start by asking you about a group that might be of particular interest to this audience, and that is women married to foreign citizens. What can you tell us about them, and specifically about a woman named Ethel Mckenzie?
Yes, so again, as a law professor writing a book, I decided I did not want it to be the typical legal history, which usually uses the voices of lawyers and judges. I wanted to use the voice and tell the story from the perspective of those who lost their citizenship. So I start the book with a story of Ethel Mckenzie, who I do think will be of particular interest to this group. Ethel Mckenzie was born in San Francisco in 1875, and she was a wealthy socialite, the daughter of a vintner in San Francisco, but she caught suffrage fever, and as she described it, and she began fighting for women's right to vote, which she helped to win for California's women in 1911, which was a good 9 years before the rest of the nation's women got the right to vote in the US Constitution. But then when she herself went down to the registrar's office to exercise this newfound right to vote, she was told, you can't vote, and in fact, you're not a citizen. And the reason was that she'd married a non-citizen, and under a US federal law enacted in 1907, she automatically lost her US citizenship, and that went on for decades. And I should add, France had a similar law. So as I say in the book, like any red-blooded American, she filed a lawsuit and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And I described that case and what happened in the aftermath in the book.
I was shocked. So just to give a little more detail. So she married a singing Scotsman, right? He was a Scottish tenor and very famous at the time. And so this became kind of a a famous case of the day, right? But it wasn't until, what was it, 1920 something, or you can tell me the date. But
yeah,
so this, what was it called? The Foreign Expatriation Act.
the Expatriation Act. Yep.
The Expatriation Act was finally lifted for some categories of women in, you can tell me what year, but explain also, if you can, what this case tells us about the intersection of discrimination against women and discrimination against people of certain national origin.
Yeah, so this is why I think Ethel Mckenzie's case is so fascinating, and this law was so fascinating, because so she took her case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court 9-0 rejected her argument and scolded her, said, if you choose to marry a non-citizen, you lose your citizenship. And as you say, she'd married this dashing Scotsman who was a very well-known singer of ballads. And the two of them were just this celebrity couple of their day, both very good looking. She knew how to work the press really well too. She was savvy from her years as a suffragist. So,
oh right, I love this. I have to interject. One of the greatest details in the book is that they eventually had a son, and there was a newspaper story published that said, "What was it? Child may vote, mother cannot." So that was one of the ways that she drummed up some public sympathy for her plight, right?
Yes. So, and there's a picture of her holding her baby aloft, and they were a fascinating family. So she loses her case. And actually there was also efforts to get Congress to reverse the law. And I read these transcripts, which you obviously can't hear any recordings from 1917, but they had little brackets for laughter when people were laughing. And the male congressmen just laughed at these women. They were scornful of the idea that they should keep their citizenship. And they said, why don't you marry good old American boys? And as I said, this was not alone, the US alone did this. France did this, England did this, I'm sure some other countries as well. So that was the situation until the nation's women got the right to vote in the 19th Amendment, which happened in 1920. And then it's fascinating to watch, because suddenly, just 2 years later, the congressmen are rushing to overrule this law, which takes away the citizenship of half their constituents, right? Or puts it at risk for those women who marry non-citizens. So they changed the law, but this is what I have to say really is telling, and of course it's a theme in the book, which is they restore the citizenship rights only for some women. And you have to parse the law. They don't use the words exactly, but it's for women who marry white men, they keep their citizenship. But if a woman marries a man who is not eligible to naturalize, which included a very large number of groups, including all Asians, all people from Middle Eastern countries, South American countries, et cetera, those women who married non-citizens from those countries, men who weren't eligible to naturalize, they continue to lose their citizenship until the 1930s.
Amanda, you mentioned that there were similar laws on the books in France. How does American citizenship practice stack up to that of other countries? And you know, you've been doing some comparative work. So tell us about American citizenship and how secure it is. I mean, obviously, as you write, America was built on somewhat lenient immigration and naturalization policy, at least for white people. How does America look when you look at a country like France, for example?
Yeah, so, and I'll mention it, the book is entirely about the United States, but I have been in France for the last 2 years researching French citizenship and immigration policy. I won't claim to be the expert in that yet, but I'm very happy to talk about what I've learned and the comparisons. And there are really some fascinating intersections and similarities, as well as differences between France and the US. So as I said, France also denied and took away French women's citizenship for marrying non-citizens. Between 1914 and 1927, at least 120,000 French women lost their citizenship. And then France got really concerned. France got concerned about its strict citizenship rules because it needed people to fight in all of its wars, and it kept losing citizens. And then people weren't eligible to be drafted. And that was true in the 19th and the 20th century, as a man named Patrick Vail, a French a law professor, has written. So France reversed that rule, and women got to keep their citizenship after 1927. France also struggled and still has debates today about birthright citizenship, which is a major theme of my book. And the US is quite exceptional in its rule of birthright citizenship, which is in its 14th Amendment. which was added to the Constitution right after the Civil War. And I think our birthright citizenship rule, which is extremely pure, if you're born on US soil, you're a US citizen, no matter what, no matter who your parents are, no matter what their immigration status, and no matter how long you remain in the US. France does not have such a rule today, but I think the US rule is really about our history of slavery. And I think the French rules of citizenship have a lot to do with its history, both immigration, colonial, and also its history of needing people to fight in its wars, which clearly motivated some of its citizenship policies over the last 100 years.
Amanda, can you elaborate on what you said about your belief that our citizenship policy is a consequence of our history of slavery?
Yes, so, and in the book, I profile a man named Hiram Rhodes Revels, who he is far from a household name in the United States, but he really should be. He's the first Black man to serve in Congress, and he served in 1870. And so he lived long enough first to see the Dred Scott decision, which I think is familiar to most Americans, the infamous case that—
remind us.
Sure, yeah. And I don't want to assume everyone listening in is familiar with US history. We're in France. So Dred and Harriet Scott were slaves, and they brought a lawsuit to the US Supreme Court, arguing they should be free. But a threshold question to their case was, are they citizens of the United States who are eligible to bring a case to the US Supreme Court? And the Supreme Court said, no, you remain a slave. And it also said, all Black people, slaves or free, are not citizens and cannot be citizens of the United States. And that was shocking and controversial in its own right. There were 500,000 free Blacks in the United States before the Civil War, and in many states they could vote, in some states they could vote, and exercise other rights of citizenship. So it was particularly shocking and controversial, along with all the other shocking and controversial parts of that case, for the court to declare they weren't citizens. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction Congress said, we now have 4.5 million former, free Black people, most of whom were former slaves. Are they citizens? That was an open question, one that was debated, what to do with this population. They made up a majority in 4 southern states. And the Reconstruction Congress said they are citizens, they are equals, they must have the equal rights of citizenship. But to ensure that this happens, and doesn't just happen today, but happens in the future, we need to amend our Constitution. So the 14th Amendment, the first sentence says, everyone born on US soil is a citizen, and it established birthright citizenship for the nation. And as a result, Hiram Revels, who had formerly not been a citizen under Dred Scott, became a citizen and was elected to serve in Congress, along with many others at the time, while Reconstruction lasted.
So the 14th Amendment is the legal bedrock of birthright citizenship in America. What happened to all the people who had seceded and fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War? I thought this was a really fascinating chapter of your book.
Yeah, and this is I'd never sort of thought about the history this way. And when you come to the US, it's 1865, and you have this big debate. And the debate is, what is going to happen to the former slaves? As I said, 4.5 million people. Are they going to be citizens? But a related question is, what is going to happen to the leaders of the Confederacy? Because they had also lost their citizenship for very different reasons. They, of course, had fought to be their own country. They had their own flag and their own currency and their own army, and they said, we're not American anymore. And in fact, Charles Sumner said they're enemy aliens. The Supreme Court described them as non-citizens. So they were also not citizens in 1865. And here was the issue. And the Reconstruction Congress saw this clearly. They said, if we let the former leaders of the Confederacy back into our union as full citizens, before we give citizenship and voting rights to the former slaves, we know what will happen. They will never give political power to these 4.5 million people. They will continue to treat them as all but slaves. And we can see what the future holds. So we need to protect their right to vote in the 15th Amendment. We need to make sure they're citizens in the 14th. And of course, they abolished slavery in the 13th Amendment. And they did this as they continued to exclude some of the leaders of the Confederacy from citizenship. So Robert E. Lee died without citizenship status. And in fact, he couldn't vote for the rest of his life. At the very end, I think he did have voting rights. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, also died without the citizenship rights of a US citizen. So of course, for many, I'm thinking, you know, the history here, which is the federal government eventually abandoned Reconstruction, while the Blacks remained citizens in name. It was in name only, sadly, in so much of the country. There was remarkable disenfranchisement. It went from 80% of the Black population voting down to 5% voting in the early 20th century. And at the same time, the former leaders of the Reconstruction the former leaders of the Confederacy regained their political power.
One of the most just delicious little details in the book was that Walt Whitman served as a pardon clerk in the Attorney General's office after the war. I found that fascinating, just imagining Walt Whitman sitting there and deciding whether these former Confederates would be pardoned or not. This is perhaps not within the scope of your book, but it was during presidential Reconstruction that the vast majority of these Confederates got their citizenship back. Is that right?
So yes, and they got it back a number of ways. So
what I want to ask you is, do you think was that a mistake? I mean,
yeah. So that's when you look at what's happening between 1865 and 1870, you see the Reconstruction Congress saying, we need to make sure that Blacks have citizenship rights and exercise political power before we give it back to the former leaders of the Confederacy. So I've already mentioned the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to everyone born in the US, making sure that all the former slaves were citizens and overruling Dred Scott. But then Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which doesn't often get referenced by anyone, including legal scholars, it said, if you were a leader of the Confederacy, you are not permitted to serve in political office. And in fact, unless you're pardoned, unless you're given by 2/3 of Congress the right to serve. So for a period of time, only the African Americans living in the South had this full rights of citizenship, and the sort of mainstream Southerners who hadn't led the secession. But men like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were denied this. And so I think it wasn't a mistake to give back political rights to most of the Southern states, most of the people there, but I think it was absolutely right not to give it back to men like Lee and Jefferson Davis. Lee in 1868, he went on record saying that he wouldn't want any Black person to be able to vote. It was very clear if he got political power, the Black population in his state, Virginia, wouldn't. So that was the protective measure they needed to enact. The problem was abandoning Reconstruction, as we all know, and I think we're still living with its consequences today.
Let's talk about another category of Americans whose citizenship has been sometimes shaky, or whose citizenship has been in jeopardy over the course of American history. What about naturalized American citizens? So as what I gathered from reading your book is that there is a gap between the theory and the practice of naturalization. Like in theory, we're not supposed to have all American citizens should enjoy the same rights and privileges, right? But you show that in practice, there are actually fine gradations in terms of the security of one's citizenship. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 3 ways of being a US citizen primarily. One is you're born on US soil. Another is you inherit your citizenship. You're born abroad, but your parents are citizens. And a third is naturalization. And which is you acquire citizenship. You start off as a non-citizen, but you become a green card holder and live in the US and pass that civics test, et cetera, and become a citizen. And the Supreme Court has been clear that naturalized citizens are equal in every way, shape, and form to native-born birthright citizens, with the one exception of you can't be president if you're not a natural-born citizen. So aside from that, you're supposed to be utterly equal and have all the rights of a US citizen. But Lauren, as you say, that has only been true in theory more than in practice. So throughout...
So give us an example.
Yeah. So there's a couple really interesting ones. So Emma Goldman, who is this firecracker of a woman, she's an anarchist from the early 20th century in the US. She was an immigrant from Russia. She naturalized when she was a teenager, lived in the US. She fought for particularly for labor rights. She was flirted with communism. She was in every way, shape, and form a thorn in the government side. And I can't describe, she was charismatic. I mean, people would flock to her speeches, and she was accused of inspiring acts of violence, although she herself didn't engage in violence. And they've now declassified these documents. I mean, the government said we need to get rid of her. How do we do it? And first they stripped citizenship, denaturalized her husband, who had given her citizenship through her marriage. And then they went after her and they took away her citizenship. And then they put her on a boat with 250 other people and deported her to Russia. And she wrote this compelling essay that said, you know, I'm a woman without a nation. I'm without a home. I'm a woman without a country. I had thought I had a country to call my own, and it's expelled me. And she was very, very powerful in giving that talk. And then I have to say, to bring it more toward present day, I attended a denaturalization trial that happened just a year and a half ago in Florida. The Trump administration ramped up denaturalization. They spent about $200 million to start an office in Los Angeles. They hired about 30 people. They started investigating 700,000 naturalized citizens. And I went to one of these trials, and the man who was being denaturalized, the target, he testified. And then his brother testified on his behalf. And the brother was not a target of this case. But during the trial, after the brother testified, the government began to cross-examine him. And they didn't ask the brother about the man who was the target of the case. They started questioning the brother about his naturalization and his immigration. And the lawyer objected and said, you know, you're intimidating this witness. You're making it seem as if he's testifying. It's putting his citizenship at risk. And the judge allowed the questioning, but it was pretty clear to me, if you bring yourself to the attention of the government and you're a naturalized citizen, you know, watch out. And your colleague at the New Yorker, Masha Gessen, who's a naturalized citizen, has said similarly, she feels at risk in a way that she didn't before, because naturalized citizens can lose their citizenship.
Right. So naturalized citizens who, you know, being outspoken politically has always been one way to find yourself in the crosshairs of immigration authorities, going all the way back to Emma Goldman. What is alarming, as you write, okay, so the operation that you were talking about, this is called Operation Janus, right? And actually, as you write, it began under the Obama administration, but then was really kicked into high gear under Trump. And so is it true? Can a naturalized American lose his or her citizenship now for something, you know, as insignificant as failing to report a parking ticket? I mean, can that happen? And also, if you can answer, if you know, has anything changed since Biden has taken office?
Yeah, so a couple points here. First, it was clear in the 1950s, the government used, and in the 1930s, and with Emma Goldman starting in 1910, the government would target people for their speech and seek to denaturalize them. And for a while, they were pretty open about that. And they said, well, if you have ties to communism, it shows you're not loyal and faithful to the US, and so we can denaturalize you. Then the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that anymore. And that was in 1967. And for a good 50 years, there was hardly anyone ever denaturalized. And if they were, it was like a former Nazi prison guard who lied about their past. And you know, I think there are legitimate grounds to denaturalize some people for significant harm or wrong that they've done, and if they lied to get citizenship. But the problem is today, and this is what the Trump administration took advantage of, and they were open about it. I mean, they've got press releases about it. They took the current law, which says you can be denaturalized for any mistake or error in the process. The way the law is written, it would cover almost anything. And at a Supreme Court oral argument, the Chief Justice Roberts, asked the government attorney, and this was in 2017, and he said to the government attorney, do you mean that if I write on the form that I haven't violated the law? Because there's a very broad question that says, have you ever violated the law, whether you were arrested or not? And Roberts said, you mean if I write on that form, I haven't violated the law? And it turns out that I drove 65 miles an hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone, where I got a parking ticket. And I failed to note that on my form, that you could then say I was unlawfully naturalized and moved to denaturalize me. And the government attorney answered yes. Now, he also lost that particular case, which was about criminal denaturalization. But it was a shocking moment. I listened to the oral argument through the audio, and you could just—
Okay, so that hasn't necessarily, we don't know that has happened, but it could. I mean, you make a really fascinating point that in terms that the immigration authorities in America have transitioned from scrutinizing bodies to scrutinizing documents. That is where people at Ellis Island or whatever were once inspected. Their physical person was inspected, and there was a lot of fear and alarmism at one time about people switching identities, right? About, you know, I think maybe you can talk about, I think the Wong Kim Ark case, but the point that you make that's really important is that the burden of flawless paperwork is extremely high now, and the bar keeps going higher and higher. So that, yeah, that what it's really hard to present now is paperwork with no mistakes in it, and that paperwork, that just executing it is basically, the execution is so difficult as to be inaccessible for many people.
Yes. I mean, I think we can make analogies to the criminal justice system in the sense that if you make enormous swaths of our conduct something that you could be stopped and arrested by a police officer for doing, then you watch the abuse of power as people pick and choose who to stop and who to arrest. So if you make the naturalization process, or if you make denaturalization turn on any error in the paperwork with no statute of limitations, and that is how the law is currently written, no statute of limitations and any error could lead to being targeted, then you put everyone at risk. And that is the problem with that law. As I explain in the book, today, citizenship stripping occurs just in a very different way. And as you just said, it's through the paperwork. So for example, if you're born outside of a hospital and you live near the southern border of the United States, the government presumes you're not a citizen. Now, you could overcome that presumption, but I'm guessing some of the people on this Zoom seminar have known this as well. When you've tried to do anything involving paperwork, it all costs a fortune. It requires tracking down documents that may or may not exist. It often requires having a stable address. So in the end, if your citizenship turns on your paperwork, it's essentially putting in sort of a wealth test to proving your citizenship, because you're presumptively not one, and your birth certificate alone won't overcome that if you're born outside of a hospital.
Talk about the suspect birth attendance list as an example of this.
So this is fascinating. And by the way, this also predates Trump. This is not all about the Trump administration, although they did pursue denaturalization in a very new and different way. But no, this predates that administration. And there is fraud. I mean, it's certainly clear that some midwives signed.
And what it is a list of midwives, and any person, right, any person whose birth is attended by one of these people on a list is an automatic target of investigation. Is that right? Yes.
And some of these people did commit fraud. They did sign birth certificates of people born in Mexico and said they were born in the US. The question is, you don't know who's on that list. You don't know why they're on that list. A lot of them have certainly not admitted to wrongdoing or been convicted of it. And a lot of them, even if they did commit fraud, signed many legitimate birth certificates of people born in the US. So as I describe in the book, there was one family that was just barred from coming back to the US for months because they had a birth certificate signed by one of these women. So yeah, it was a big problem for that population.
How much do you think the birther movement has destabilized American notions of citizenship?
So I think that the birther movement, which of course we're talking here about the argument that the baseless argument that President Barack Obama wasn't born in the US and wasn't a birthright citizen eligible to be president. So one of the things I find fascinating, and I found this, I remember it at the time and I thought it was laughable, as did a lot of the press. But if you look back, you see that people believed it. And in fact, in 2016, at least some reputable polls had more than half the population either thinking Barack Obama wasn't born in the US or questioning that. And I really see a connection between that attempt to legitimize President Obama to the attempts to claim that Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first African-American senator, was not a citizen, because people argued that despite the 14th Amendment. And Kamala Harris, another African-American senator, now our vice president, she also faced completely baseless claims that she wasn't a citizen because she was born to immigrants. So at that point, we had 10 senators in the entire US history who were African-American, of which 3 of those had their citizenship questioned in ways that were attempting to undermine their legitimacy. And I see a real connection to the—
Meanwhile, Mitt Romney, what is Mitt Romney's citizenship story? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so by the way, it's sort of funny how many people running for president weren't born in the US. Now, Mitt Romney it was his
father was born in Mexico, is that right?
He was born in Mexico. And I am not familiar with all the details of that.
Okay, but in that sense, foreign-born father, although his father was an American citizen.
Yeah.
birthright citizen son, a parallel situation, yet no birth or movement erupted.
No. Well, John McCain was born outside of the US in the Panama Canal Zone, and Ted Cruz was born in Canada. And while I don't particularly want Ted Cruz to be president, I would never argue that he's not legitimate because he was born a US citizen. He was born to a US citizen parent. But it's amazing how often people run for president who have some, born outside the US. Barack Obama was born in the United States, but, get people to believe that. It was hard, despite releasing his birth certificate.
One statistic that really stood out to me is the fact that 1% of people in custody of immigration authorities at any given time in America are actually American citizens. How do those people get caught up in that dragnet? And why doesn't anyone know that they are American citizens?
Yeah, so Jacqueline Stevens, a professor at Northwestern, a political scientist, studied this closely. And she's sort of funny about it because she asked ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, how many of your population are US citizens? And they said, well, we never keep track of when we make an error. We don't keep track of that. And then when she released her study, they said, we don't keep American citizens. We never do that. And she said, well, you just told me you don't keep track. I tracked it for you and I found out you did. So the answer, how does this happen? Well, a couple of different ways. One is the whole border zone. There's a 100-mile zone around the United States. The 100-mile zone in which the constitutional protections that normally stop people from being stopped and searched don't apply in the same way.
Well, I was actually curious about this when I was reading.
Yeah.
So is it the northern and the southern border, but then is there like a maritime zone as well? Or how does it, do you have to just be really landlocked to not be in any danger of being stopped with no probable cause? Or how
Two-thirds of the United States population live within the 100-mile zone. It's the entire, if you look at the map of the US, the entire border area, 100 miles. And there's some debate around airports.
Okay, but sea borders count?
Yep.
Okay.
And so you can be stopped and questioned. And as I describe in the book, a rising high school senior on his way to a soccer tryout, who was like, I think 60 or 70 miles from the border, was stopped, and the officials thought he had forged paperwork. He brought his paperwork with him, showing he was a citizen. Because if you're traveling within that area and probably it's that you're not white, you carry that document. Like, it's very normal for people to carry proof of citizenship because they don't want to be stopped. And so he did have proof of citizenship. They didn't believe him. And some people are for that reason, they claim they're citizens and they try to prove it and the government won't believe them. Others don't even know they're citizens themselves, which is an interesting problem, but the government is supposed to investigate that. Mm-hmm. Groups suffer from like mental illness and they're just not good advocates on their own behalf, which is another problem we often see in our criminal justice system, and they can get deported. And they're citizens, they're often nowhere near the border, but the government thinks they're not.
So Amanda, your book is a survey, but as I said at the beginning, it also makes an argument. You write that revoking citizenship has its roots in the oldest American contradiction of all, a nation founded in freedom, liberty, and equality that at the same time permitted slavery. So as you said earlier, you see a direct line from the failure of Reconstruction to where things stand today. What do you see for the future of citizenship and citizenship? That is
it's very hard to say.
Citizenship stripping, say that aloud 10 times, in America. And how, do you think there is any prospect of the United States finding a resolution to this inherent, foundational contradiction?
Yes. So when I think about citizenship stripping, I think in a way it really embodies that contradiction that is the United States, which is we claim to be a nation of immigrants. And in fact, the United States has welcomed, I think it was 2/3 of the world's immigrants in a 100-year period leading up to through the 20th century. And at times we've had very liberal naturalization policies, but I think the United States has also struggled with that identity for its entire existence. And of course, the founding hypocrisy of a nation that declares all men are created equal in a Declaration of Independence written by slave owners is, I think, unfortunately, a legacy we still live with today and have not overcome. So I see citizenship stripping as the embodiment of that in two ways. One is this very sort of practical legal way, which is I see citizenship stripping as a way to take away civil rights and political rights from disfavored groups and individuals. So you can prevent people from voting and you can deport them when you take away their citizenship. And that was the clear goal at times. But I also see it as identity forming. So I think to the degree naturalization policy or citizenship policy is an existential issue about who we are as a nation, I think even more so when you take away citizenship, you're sending a message. You're sending it, of course, to the person in the group you're taking citizenship from. So for example, the Japanese Americans coerced into giving up their citizenship during World War II were very much an example of that. But you're also sending the message to everybody else in the nation. You're saying, who are we as a nation? And I see citizenship stripping as sending a message and a being about belonging and identity as much as anything else.
As much as I wish we could go on, I know that we're nearing Q&A time. Alice, do you want to take it from here?
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, fabulous. So I will just pin you. Great. Okay, so if you've just joined us, maybe after the introduction, you are at Evenings with an Author, hosted at the American Library in Paris, and you're in the middle of hearing a fabulous discussion between Lauren Collins and Amanda Frost to discuss Amanda's new book, You Are Not American. We are now moving to the section of the event, which is the Q&A. So if you haven't posted your question or comment for Amanda, now is your chance to do that, and I will read it out for you. So Amanda, we have a question about why did you become interested in French citizenship after spending so much time studying American?
Yeah, so I thought, first of all, I think the comparative perspective is always helpful to understanding both what's going on in the United States, and also I'm a Francophile. I find France fascinating, and it's also a country of immigration. It's a country that has always had a high rate of immigration, at least compared to many other European countries. So I was interested. I also became particularly fascinated after reading Patrick Vale's terrific book. He wrote it originally in French, but it's translated in the title. I love it. It's How to Be French. So I thought that was a good title, and he really beautifully describes the fascinating history of French citizenship. So that inspired me. I should add, another great scholar named Claire Zalk has written a book called Denaturalized, recently translated into English and published by Harvard University Press. It describes how France took away the citizenship of 15,000 people, mostly Jews, during the Vichy period during World War II. And obviously there's many parallels there with the denaturalization of that population, which of course led to deportation and often death. And what I'm describing happened in the United States. So the parallels interested me, the overlap interested me. And of course, I also see many differences. I think France's history of citizenship and citizenship stripping is a lot about both its involvement in, what must have felt like endless wars to the population in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also to colonialism and its history of colonialism. And the US history is, as I said, I think very much about slavery and the ongoing racism of the society.
Yeah, I think that resonates with a question, or more a comment. Emily wrote that, and I'm sure you're aware of this, certain countries in the Middle East still have laws disallowing women from passing their citizenship onto their children if they marry foreign men. I mean, can you talk about the comparison with other countries?
Yeah. So first, as I said already, in France also stripped citizenship of its women who married non-citizens, as did the US, as did England. And that was all in the early 20th century. And if you look back at the rhetoric around that, so much of it was this sort of interesting intersection between both sexism and xenophobia. So first of all, the criticism in the US was, why don't you marry good old American boys? Why? They didn't like the competition. But, and there was also a sort of fear, right, of the stranger or the other. There was also, of course, the lingering idea of coverture, the idea that women did not have independent citizenship. And, women were just beginning to do things like get control of their bank accounts and their salaries and their ability to inherit property. But it wasn't so clear for a long period of time they had independent identity. And indeed, the family would have one passport, and the passport was in the name of the husband. So all of those forces shaped English and French and US rules around citizenship stripping of women who married non-citizens. But I'll also note a couple of interesting points here. One is that France continued to have some sexist citizenship policies, in that French men who became dual citizens in the 60s and early 70s and maybe 50s as well, they could keep their French citizenship. But French women who became dual citizens lost it. And so up until 1973, you could lose your French citizenship under a rule that treated women differently than men. But France has made efforts to rectify that through sort of citizenship as restitution. So if a child can show that their mother lost citizenship under that sexist rule, they could apply for French citizenship. And I know someone who's done that. And I will say Europe has actually used various forms of restitution and reparation to try to give citizenship back to groups that lost it. So most famously, maybe Germany, to not just those stripped of citizenship, but their children during World War II, the Jewish population. Spain and Portugal, to the Sephardic Jews from 500 years ago, descendants of that population can get citizenship back. So it's really interesting. And I wonder if the US shouldn't consider the same restitution, giving citizenship to some groups that lost it or were denied it in ways that were clearly racist, xenophobic, sexist, et cetera, in our earlier history. Now, the question about the Middle East, it's true, the Middle East continues to keep some of these laws in place there. It may well be they have a change of heart about them in the future, just as the US did.
Oh, fab, wonderful. We have a question about, this is from Elspeth. Elspeth writes, race, religion, and it is true that citizenship doesn't fit into a sentence very nicely. Race, religion, and citizenship seem to be very closely connected both in the US and France. Do you see any way to move away from this convergence?
Yes, and a terrific question. And actually, it's interesting, and I'll just allude here to Barack Obama, who was not Muslim, he's Christian, and in any case, being Muslim would have nothing to do with citizenship or eligibility to be president. And yet it came up all the time in the birther movement, as if someone who was Muslim couldn't be American and couldn't be a citizen, which was pretty shocking to to those of us who thought we were living in a more modern nation than that. But it was interesting to see those equated. So even in the modern day, we see those ties coming together. And I mean, the question is sort of how can we disentangle those? I would say the struggle is maybe a never-ending one, but that's what we have to acknowledge. I see progress being made, but I don't see it as a smooth path forward. I see it as stops and starts and sometimes moving backwards. And the answer is to, at least for the United States, I certainly won't speak for France, but I think we have to face our history in a way that as a nation, the United States has really not done yet. I mean, we still have, is it over 1,000 monuments to Confederate leaders in the United States? I saw a recent news story that said there's $40 million spent annually to upkeep them. I mean, we need to face the history in a way that we have not, and that might move us forward to recognizing the equality of all citizens, which is really what we need to do as a nation.
Yeah, this is a question that I had, Amanda. If you could change one thing about America's kind of what to you is the most urgent part of where would you I know you're probably like, where do I begin?
Yes, there's a lot to fix.
Yeah.
So
where would you begin?
Yeah, so I will say, I mean, some of you may have heard of a book called The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander, that became a bestseller in the United States over a decade ago now. And I in no way, shape, or form would I compare my book to hers. Hers was brilliant. But I was trying to do something in the same vein, because what she was pointing out, and she wrote right as Obama was elected, so it was a moment when we sort of felt like we were healing as a nation. But she pointed out that many of the rules around policing, in particular, and incarceration, were repeating the past. And she drew a line that I hadn't even thought about myself, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So she starts off with a story of a man who's a slave and can't vote. And then his son lives in the Jim Crow South, and so he can't vote. He's disenfranchised by those laws and rules. And then his grandson is a felon, and under rules that disenfranchise felon, his grandson alive today can't vote. And she said there's a connection there. The way we police, the way we manipulate the law, it applies only to certain people and not others, and we see the abuses. And she wrote that book, as I said, over 10 years ago, and then we just, of course, have seen the Chauvin trial, which led to the conviction of a white police officer for killing a Black man in his custody. And there's plenty of examples of that. And I think we're beginning to face as a nation what the disparities in the application of the law. So the connection to my book is when we look at our rules surrounding citizenship, naturalization, citizenship stripping, and immigration, I think there's a mistaken view by many Americans that, well, the law is neutral and race neutral, and it's applied evenly to all. And the point of my book is, no, it's not. And we need to face that and change the way we apply those laws and think about both immigration and citizenship in the United States.
I wonder how you feel, Amanda, about this kind of more call to action type writing in relation to your academic writing. Could you speak a bit to
that? Well, I will say first and foremost, my book was intended to be for a mainstream audience because I got tired of speaking to academics and I wanted to reach more people. At what point did you get tired and why? Well, it's funny, law professors are kind of a different breed of academic because I was a lawyer for 7 years and continued practicing law even after I was an academic. So I was never purely in the ivory tower. I ran our immigrant justice clinic and worked with immigrant populations and brought students to the border to work with asylum seekers. So I think in that way, law professors like me are often a little more wanting to speak to the broader population anyway. But the other goal I had was just not to write something that was painful to read. So a more superficial goal. But I intended for this book to be the kind of book you could pick up and find yourself absorbed in. Not that you would necessarily take lots of notes about or highlight. And so I hope that it is that kind of a book. And that was my other goal with the book, to reach a broader audience. Because as I said, I don't think the United States has faced or acknowledged this history. And I will add that I came to this research about 5 years ago, pretty educated, and I didn't know a lot of what I found out. I did not know until about 5 years ago that women lost their citizenship for marrying non-citizens. That was one of the many things that shocked me. And I thought that more people needed to learn about this history.
Yeah, Lauren has written in the chat and she, took the words up. It is a totally beautifully written book and it reads.
Thank you.
It's lovely. And thank you for sending it to me. And I wish I normally have a copy of the books to hold. Can you hold it up for me? Lovely. Lauren, can you hold yours up too? Nice.
Thank you. And I will say that, by the way, although I liked the title, it is a tongue twister and almost no one can say it right. I practiced for months, but Alice, I was impressed you did say it right. So that's the only problem with the title. But
no, there are no problems. It's a fantastic book. And the only reason I'm not holding it up is because it's been so popular at the library. I'm about 6th on the waiting list. And so luckily I read the PDF. But okay, we have some questions. Quite a few people are talking about renouncing their US citizenship. Can you speak to this?
Well, so I was going to say that's I get this question a lot when I give this talks about this in France or in Europe, which I've done, because, and I'm happy to answer more, chat about this in the cocktail portion of tonight, because I know that it's a burden to have US citizenship when you live abroad for many reasons, including, taxes and banks. I mean, opening a bank account as an American is complex because nobody wants you because of all the paperwork requirements. And I know people who very much feel affiliated and connected to the United States, and they don't want to give up their US citizenship, but it's so difficult and so hard that they feel the need to renounce. And I will add that you can renounce your citizenship. And in fact, I think you should be able to. So the United States was formed, we kind of created this idea that you can control your own citizenship. After all, that's the Declaration of Independence, right? We're no longer British, we're American over here. And no one can tell us that we have to be British. And in fact, even the War of 1812 was over that issue in part because Britain kept saying, you can't choose your citizenship and we're going to impress your sailors and put them on our boats. And the US said, no, they're Americans if they've naturalized. So the idea of volitional citizenship by choice is very American. And you have a right under a federal law to renounce your citizenship. You have to jump through a bunch of hoops. And I'm fine with that. It shouldn't be too easy because I'd be worried about coercion. But you can renounce your citizenship. But I think the real problem is the US should make laws, should make it easier for people to live abroad with US citizenship without renouncing. I think that's the problem.
I think many people who live in France, myself included, can agree to that. We have a question from Oslem who wants to know, Amanda, do you have any cases of US citizens outside of the US who were stripped of their citizenship? And if so, do you notice patterns there?
Yes, so it's really millions of people that lost their citizenship, which is again something I don't think enough of us know about. And some of those people were naturalized citizens who moved abroad. So for a while, if you naturalized, became a US citizen, but then moved back to, it didn't have to be the home country, it could be anywhere out of the US had the view that they could take away citizenship. I also looked at archival records showing that some poor guy would come to the Italian embassy in Rome, the US embassy in Rome, and say, this would be in maybe the 1920s, and say, well, I'm an American, I was born in the US and raised there. And the consular official would say, well, you've lived in Italy for a really long time, we don't think you're American anymore. And they would basically just take away his citizenship through the paperwork, de facto, right? Not through any careful legal process. They wouldn't give him a passport. So there were those people. There were people who voted in foreign elections, not knowing for a while that could be a basis for losing citizenship, but they did that while living abroad. And there were people who joined a foreign army or were coerced into joining a foreign army, as happened in Japan during World War II. And they automatically lost their citizenship. So they were definitely targets, the people who lived abroad. But, again, you have plenty of people living abroad who didn't lose their citizenship. It was very much a selective group that lost their rights to come back to the US.
So Amanda, you are in France right now. You're in Lyon, and Lauren is in Paris, and we're in Paris, although the library is currently spookily empty. I wonder, I guess you've been living here for 2 years, you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay, so it seems to me there's an interesting kind of connection between citizenship and this idea, the sense of belonging, right? Because you can have citizenship, and Lauren's fantastic book is a testament to this. You can have citizenship and you don't speak the language, or you don't have a spouse, or so what can you speak maybe to this relationship of citizenship and then actually feeling like you belong to a country, because that's not necessarily legal?
Yes, exactly. There is this component to citizenship which is qualitative, and of course the dreamers in the US, the population of undocumented immigrants brought to the US as children who are culturally fully American, they just aren't legally American. There's that issue. Lauren's book, which I adored when in French, I read it right before we moved to France, also addresses these issues of belonging. And of course, language is huge. And I would love to be more integrated in France, and I speak very competent and very unpretty French. So I will always immediately stand out like a sore thumb as a non-French person. And so even if I were to get French citizenship, which I've looked into, at the end of the day, would I always be in part an outsider? I'm sure I would always feel that. But, in the United States, one of the things that I think is a strength of the United States is that because there are so many immigrants from so many different parts of the world, that in some ways it's sort of unusual not to have an immigration story, and not to know that your grandfather or father or great-grandfather, where they came from. And in some ways that sort of sense of everyone coming from somewhere else, obviously Native Americans accepted, and they're a fascinating citizenship story, by the way. But the fact that's such a mixed, almost a melange of people, it is, I think in a way, I hope would make feeling of belonging in the United States easier, even for groups that are newly arrived, because there's sort of no one dominant immigrant group, and just about all of us are immigrants, one generation to the next.